The September sun blazed mercilessly across the Arizona desert as the military convoy pressed eastward through the shimmering heat. Dust devils danced on the horizon, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolent intent. Inside the canvas-covered wagon, 22-year-old Alice Monroe dabbed perspiration from her brow with an already damp handkerchief, her pale blue traveling dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin despite the shade. "How much farther to Tucson, Lieutenant Davis?" she called to the young officer riding alongside her wagon. "Another day's journey, Miss Monroe." He replied, straightening his posture at being addressed by Colonel Monroe's daughter. "We'll make camp at Dragoon Springs before nightfall." Alice nodded and settled back against the uncomfortable wooden seat. At 22, she had spent her entire life moving from one military fort to another, following her father's assignments across the frontier. Fort Bowie had been home for 3 years longer than most places, and she had grown accustomed to its stone walls and the constant vigilance required in Apache territory. Now she was leaving it all behind for a new life, as the wife of Captain Jonathan Sterling, a man she had met only twice during formal military functions. A strategic alliance, her father had called it when he announced the arrangement 6 months earlier. Colonel William Monroe was not a man whose decisions were questioned least of all by his only daughter. Alice had accepted her fate with the same quiet dignity she had shown since her mother's death 10 years earlier. The wagon jolted over a rock, bringing her back to the present moment. Through a gap in the canvas, she glimpsed the rugged landscape, a vast expanse of red earth, dotted with towering saguaro cacti and thorny mesquite backed by the distant silhouette of mountains. Despite the dangers it harbored, Alice couldn't help but admire the wild beauty of the Arizona territory. Lieutenant Davis suddenly raised his hand, signaling the convoy to halt. Alice peered out curiously as the lieutenant conferred briefly with Sergeant Miller before riding back to her wagon. "Is something wrong?" she asked, noting the tightness around his young eyes. "Just a precaution, Miss Monroe." His tone was reassuring, but Alice had grown up around soldiers she knew when they were concerned. Scout spotted dust in the distance. "Apaches," she whispered. Lieutenant Davis forced a smile. "Probably just a herd of pronghorn. Still, we'll tighten formation. Nothing to worry about." But as the convoy resumed its journey, the soldiers moved closer to the wagon rifles at the ready. Alice felt a familiar knot of tension in her stomach. She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew the small Derringer pistol her father had insisted she carry. It was elegant with a pearl handle, a lady's gun, but it could fire 2 shots, and Colonel Monroe had personally taught her how to use it. "Remember, Allison," he had said during their practice sessions, "aim for the center of the body. Don't hesitate." She checked that it was loaded before tucking it into her dress pocket. The weight of it against her thigh was oddly comforting. The attack came with terrifying suddenness. The first indication was a high-pitched war cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the air filled with arrows, followed by the sharp crack of rifles. The disciplined response of the soldiers dissolved into chaos as Apache warriors materialized from behind rocks and scrub brush that Alice would have sworn couldn't conceal a jackrabbit. "Get down, Miss Monroe," Lieutenant Davis shouted just before an arrow caught him in the chest. He tumbled from his horse, eyes wide with shock and pain. Alice ducked below the wagon's seat as bullets splintered the wood around her. The driver slumped forward, blood spreading across his back. The horses reared in panic, nearly overturning the wagon before their reins were seized by unseen hands. Through gaps in the canvas, Alice caught horrifying glimpses of the battle, or rather, the slaughter. The Apache warriors moved like wraiths, their bodies painted for war, striking with lethal precision. The soldiers fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by the surprise and ferocity of the attack. When the firing finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the desert. Alice remained frozen in her hiding place, the Derringer clutched in her trembling hand. She could hear voices speaking in a harsh, unfamiliar language, punctuated by the occasional groan of a wounded soldier being finished off. The canvas at the back of the wagon was suddenly ripped away. Alice raised her pistol, but before she could fire, a powerful hand gripped her wrist. The gun discharged harmlessly into the air. The man who pulled her roughly from the wagon was tall and powerfully built, his copper skin gleaming with sweat and painted with streaks of red and black. His long black hair was bound with a strip of red cloth, and a single eagle feather hung from it. But it was his eyes that captured Alice's attention, dark as obsidian and burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. He spoke sharply in Apache, his grip tightening when she didn't respond. "I don't understand," Alice said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite her terror. The warrior regarded her silently for a moment, then switched to accented but clear English. "Daughter of Bluecoat, you are now prisoner of Hawkeye." Alice lifted her chin, determined not to show fear. "My father will come for me. Colonel Monroe will hunt you down." A cold smile curved the warrior's lips. "I count on it." Around them, other warriors were stripping the dead soldiers of weapons and supplies. Alice averted her eyes from the carnage, focusing instead on the man before her, Hawkeye. She had heard the name whispered with fear at Fort Bowie, a warrior known for his deadly accuracy with both bow and rifle, responsible for dozens of soldier deaths. He bound her wrists with leather strips, though not cruelly tight, then led her to a waiting horse. With surprising gentleness, he lifted her onto its back before mounting behind her. As they prepared to ride, one of the other warriors approached, gesturing toward Alice and speaking rapidly in Apache. Hawkeye's reply was curt, his tone leaving no room for argument. The other warrior scowled but backed away. "What did he want?" Alice asked, dreading the answer. Hawkeye's breath was warm against her ear as he answered. "He thinks we should kill you now. Save trouble. And why didn't you agree?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. His arm tightened around her waist as he urged the horse forward. "Dead, you bring one day of satisfaction. Alive, you bring Colonel to us." There was a pause before he added, "And I gave my word to White Dove." Before Alice could ask who White Dove was, they were galloping away from the site of the ambush, dust billowing behind them as they headed toward the looming Chiricahua Mountains. She took one last look at the bodies of her escorts scattered across the red earth, knowing that once they disappeared from view, her old life would vanish with them. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Alice Monroe rode into captivity with the enemy her father had taught her to hate, unaware that her journey was just beginning. 3 days later, deep in the Chiricahua Mountains, 3 days of hard riding had left Alice exhausted and aching. Each night the Apache band had made brief camps where she was given water and pemmican, but little rest before they moved on at first light. They traveled deeper into the Chiricahua Mountains, following trails invisible to her eyes, climbing ever higher into territory where no military patrol had ever successfully pursued them. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they finally reached their destination, a hidden valley nestled between towering cliffs. A clear stream cut through its center, feeding a small lake and nurturing cottonwoods and willows that provided welcome shade. Scattered among the trees were Wickiup's dome-shaped dwellings covered with brush and hides. As they rode into the encampment, Apache women and children emerged from the dwellings. Their initial cries of welcome died away when they spotted Alice, replaced by hostile murmurs. One woman spat on the ground as they passed. "They hate me," Alice said quietly. Hawkeye dismounted and lifted her down from the horse. "You are daughter of man, who burned 3 villages, who sent children and old ones on long walk where many died." His tone was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "What do you expect?" Alice wanted to protest that she wasn't responsible for her father's actions, but the words died in her throat. How could she defend Colonel Monroe to people who had suffered at his command? Hawkeye led her toward one of the larger Wickiups, ignoring the comments from the gathered Apache. At the entrance stood an elderly woman, her face deeply lined, but her back straight and proud. She wore a buckskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, and her gray hair was braided with strips of red cloth similar to Hawkeye's headband. "Grandmother." Hawkeye said respectfully in English, presumably for Alice's benefit. "I have brought daughter of Bluecoat." The old woman studied Alice with penetrating dark eyes that missed nothing. "So I see." Her English was better than Hawkeye's, her voice strong despite her age. "I am White Dove. You will stay in my lodge." Alice was startled. "You're White Dove, but you expected me to want your death." The old woman finished with a smile that held no humor. "There has been enough death. Come inside." The interior of the wickiup was surprisingly cool and comfortable. Woven mats covered the earthen floor, and bedding of soft furs was arranged around the edges. A small fire pit occupied the center, currently unlit in the summer heat. White Dove gestured for Alice to sit, then cut the bindings from her wrists. "You must be hungry and thirsty. Rest now. We will talk later." After the old woman left, Alice sank down onto the furs, her legs trembling with fatigue. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as questions tumbled through her mind. Why had they brought her here instead of killing her? What did they intend to do with her? And why was White Dove showing her kindness? Her contemplation was interrupted when the entrance flap was pushed aside. A young Apache woman entered, carrying a clay pot of water and a wooden bowl containing some kind of stew. She set them down without meeting Alice's eyes, then quickly departed. Alice drank deeply, then sampled the stew. It contained unfamiliar herbs and vegetables, but hunger made it taste delicious. As she ate, she took stock of her situation. Her dress was torn and filthy from the journey, her once neat hair a tangled mess. Her face felt raw from sun and wind, and every muscle in her body ached. Yet she was alive, which was more than could be said for Lieutenant Davis and the others. When White Dove returned, Alice had finished eating and was attempting to bring some order to her appearance. "The sun has marked you," White Dove observed, touching her own cheek to indicate Alice's sunburn. "Your skin is not made for our land." "Nothing about me is made for your land," Alice replied with unexpected candor. White Dove chuckled. "Perhaps not. Yet here you are." She sat across from Alice, her movements graceful despite her age. "Do you know why you live when others died?" Alice shook her head. 3 winters ago, soldiers came to our winter camp near Skeleton Canyon. Your father led them." White Dove's voice remained even, but her eyes darkened with remembered pain. "My daughter had just given birth. The soldiers came at dawn. They burned the wickiup, shot those who ran. My daughter died with her baby in her arms." Alice felt sick. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Hawkeye was away hunting. When he returned, he found his wife and son dead. His heart turned to stone that day." White Dove paused. "He vowed to kill Bluecoat and all who followed him." "Then why am I still alive?" Alice asked. "Because I asked him to spare you," White Dove said simply. "Killing the daughter will not bring back the son. It will only put more hatred in the world. We have enough already." Before Alice could respond, shouting erupted outside the wickiup. White Dove rose quickly and went to the entrance. Alice followed, peering past her. A group of warriors had gathered in the center of the camp, arguing heatedly. At their center stood Hawkeye and a shorter, powerfully built man whose face was marked with old scars. The scarred man gestured angrily toward White Dove's wickiup toward Alice. "What's happening?" she asked anxiously. "Black Knife challenges Hawkeye's decision to bring you here." White Dove explained, her expression grave. "He says you should be ransomed or killed, not given shelter." As they watched, the argument grew more heated. Suddenly, Black Knife lunged forward, shoving Hawkeye hard in the chest. In an instant, both men had drawn knives. "Stop them!" Alice gasped. White Dove shook her head. I cannot. This is men's business. The two warriors circled each other as the others formed a ring around them. Black Knife struck first his blade, slashing toward Hawkeye's throat. Hawkeye deflected the blow and countered with a thrust that Black Knife barely evaded. They fought with deadly grace that spoke of long experience, neither man giving ground. Blood soon appeared a cut on Black Knife's arm, a slash across Hawkeye's shoulder. The crowd grew silent, watching intently as the battle continued. Then Black Knife feinted left, before driving his knife toward Hawkeye's stomach. Hawkeye twisted away, but not quickly enough to avoid the blade entirely. It sliced across his ribs, drawing a bright line of blood. Black Knife pressed his advantage, forcing Hawkeye back. For a terrible moment, Alice thought she was about to witness Hawkeye's death. But as Black Knife lunged forward for the killing blow, Hawkeye dropped to one knee, ducking under the other man's arm. His knife flashed upward, stopping just short of Black Knife's throat. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Black Knife froze the edge of Hawkeye's blade, dimpling the skin of his neck. For several heartbeats, neither man moved. Then Hawkeye spoke, his voice carrying clearly to where Alice stood. Bluecoat's daughter is mine by right of capture. I choose what happens to her. He lowered his knife and stepped back. This matter is settled. Black Knife touched his throat where the blade had pressed, then gave a curt nod. The crowd began to disperse, though many cast curious glances toward Alice before returning to their tasks. White Dove sighed. Come back inside, child. There is nothing more to see. As Alice turned to follow, she caught Hawkeye looking in her direction. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them. Not hostility, not exactly, but a recognition, a connection she couldn't explain. He pressed a hand to his bleeding side, then walked away. 2 weeks later, the weeks that followed Alice's arrival in the Apache camp passed in a blur of new experiences and hard-learned lessons. True to White Dove's word, Alice was put to work immediately, grinding corn into meal, carrying water from the stream, collecting firewood, and helping with the endless tasks that sustained the camp. The work was backbreaking, nothing like the domestic duties she had performed at Fort Bowie. By the end of each day, her hands were blistered, her back aching, and her pale skin burned despite the woven hat White Dove had given her for protection. Yet she persevered, driven by stubborn determination not to appear weak. Most of the Apache women ignored her or treated her with open hostility, speaking around her in their language and laughing when she made mistakes. Only White Dove showed her kindness, patiently correcting her errors and explaining unfamiliar tasks. Why are you helping me? Alice asked one evening, as they sat outside the wickiup watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. The others hate me. White Dove's weathered hands continued their work, weaving a basket with nimble efficiency. They do not hate you. They hate what you represent. My father, Alice said softly. White Dove nodded. Bluecoat the soldiers, all who have driven us from our lands and killed our people. She paused in her weaving. But you are not your father. How can you be so certain? The old woman's dark eyes studied her face. I have watched you. You work without complaint. You learn our ways. You do not look at us as if we are animals. A slight smile touched her lips. And you have kind eyes. Alice was startled by the unexpected compliment. I always thought the Apache were savages. That's what everyone at the fort said. And what do you think now? Alice looked around the camp, taking in the children playing the women, working together, the sense of community that pervaded everything. I think your people different from those I grew up with. But people, White Dove nodded, satisfied. That is why I help you. Because you can see, Hawkeye remained a distant figure during this time. Alice occasionally glimpsed him returning from hunting expeditions or engaged in council with other warriors, but he seemed to deliberately avoid her. The one time they had accidentally crossed paths at the stream, he had acknowledged her with a brief nod before continuing on his way. His avoidance bothered her more than it should have. One blazing afternoon, as Alice struggled up the path from the stream, carrying 2 heavy water jars, one slipped from her grasp and shattered on the rocky ground. She stared at the broken pottery and spilled water in dismay, knowing she would have to return to the stream and start over. As she knelt to collect the shards, a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she found Hawkeye standing over her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said automatically. "I'll clean this up." He didn't respond immediately, just watched as she gathered the broken pieces. Then he took the remaining water jar from beside her and lifted it easily. "Come," he said, turning back toward the stream. Surprised, Alice followed. They walked in silence until they reached the water's edge. Hawkeye filled the jar he carried, then handed it to her. "Thank you," she said, adjusting her grip on the heavy container. He studied her for a moment, taking in her sunburned face and chapped hands. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "That you would break, cry, beg to be returned to your father." His honesty was startling. Alice straightened her shoulders despite the weight of the jar. "I'm stronger than I look." Something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes. "Yes, you are." He reached for a second water jar that someone had left by the stream and filled it. "White Dove says you learn quickly." "I try to," Alice replied, strangely pleased by the comment. "Though I'm still clumsy with many things." "This is not your world," Hawkeye said, lifting the second jar. "Yet you adapt." They walked back toward the camp together, the silence between them now oddly comfortable. When they reached the path that led to White Dove's wickiup, Hawkeye handed her the second jar. "My wife was also strong," he said unexpectedly. "She would have respected your spirit." Before Alice could respond to this surprising statement, he turned and walked away, leaving her staring after him with a strange tightness in her chest. That evening, as she helped White Dove prepare the evening meal, Alice found herself asking about Hawkeye. He spoke of his wife today, she said, trying to sound casual as she stirred the cooking pot. White Dove looked up from the herbs she was crushing. "Did he? That is unusual. Hawkeye rarely speaks of Morning Star, even to me." "Morning Star," Alice repeated softly. "Was that her name?" "Yes. She was my daughter, as beautiful as the dawn and twice as fierce." White Dove's voice held pride tinged with sorrow. She and Hawkeye were matched from childhood. Their hearts beat as one. Alice felt a strange pang at these words. He must have loved her very much. Love is too small a word for what they shared. White Dove added the crushed herbs to the pot. When she died, the best part of him died too. "Will he ever heal?" Alice asked hesitantly. White Dove gave her a shrewd look. "Why do you ask this?" Alice busied herself with the cooking, avoiding the older woman's penetrating gaze. "Just curiosity." White Dove didn't sound convinced. "Some wounds leave scars that never fade, but even the deepest scars can be touched without pain in time." October 1875, the gift. Days later, Alice was gathering berries on the edge of the valley when she heard horses approaching. Dropping to a crouch behind a juniper bush, she watched as Hawkeye and 3 other warriors rode into view. They had clearly been hunting game birds hung from their saddles, and Hawkeye carried a freshly killed deer across his horse. As they passed her hiding place, Alice made the mistake of shifting position. A twig snapped beneath her foot, causing Hawkeye to whirl toward the sound rifle instantly in hand. "It's just me," she called quickly, standing with her hands raised, the basket of berries hanging from her arm. Hawkeye lowered his rifle, his momentary tension easing. He spoke briefly to the other warriors who continued toward the camp with their catch. "You should not wander alone," he said as he dismounted, leading his horse to water. "It is not safe." "I'm not wandering. I'm gathering berries for White Dove." Alice held up her half-filled basket as evidence. "And I didn't think I needed permission to walk within sight of the camp." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at her defiance. "Always ready to fight, even without weapons." "I was raised by a soldier," she reminded him. Yes, blue coat. His expression darkened. A man who gives no mercy. Alice couldn't deny it. Her father's reputation for ruthlessness in dealing with the Apache was well earned. He is harsh, she admitted. But he's still my father. Hawkeye studied her for a long moment. You do not defend his actions. How can I? I've seen how your people live now. I've heard the stories. She met his gaze directly. What was done to your wife, to your son, it was wrong. Something shifted in his eyes at her words, surprise perhaps, or momentary softening. He looked away, scanning the horizon, as if seeking escape from the conversation. Your deer will spoil if you don't get it back to camp, Alice said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. He nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something small that caught the sunlight. For you, he said, holding it out. It was a comb made of bone, decorated with intricate carvings and tiny blue beads. Alice took it hesitantly, turning it over in her hand. It's beautiful, she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gift. But why? Your hair, he explained, gesturing vaguely. It gets in your eyes when you work. This will help. It was such a practical reason, yet the gesture itself felt significant. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded once, then mounted his horse and rode away without another word, leaving Alice standing among the juniper bushes, with the comb clutched in her hand, and a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. That night, Alice used the comb to tame her unruly hair, weaving it into a long braid, as she had seen the Apache women do. When she emerged from the wickiup, White Dove noticed immediately. The comb suits you, the old woman remarked. Hawkeye chose well. Alice touched the ornament self-consciously. You knew he gave it to me. I saw him carving it these past nights. White Dove's eyes held a knowing look. He has watched you more than you realize. The thought sent a flutter through Alice's stomach that she tried to ignore. He pities me, perhaps. White Dove made a dismissive sound. Hawkeye does not give gifts out of pity. She stirred the cooking fire thoughtfully. Be careful with your heart, Summerhawk. Summerhawk? Alice questioned. It is what I call you in my thoughts, White Dove explained. Brave and proud like the hawk, but with the warmth of summer in your eyes. Alice was touched by the personal name. And what should I be careful of? The old woman looked toward where Hawkeye sat with the other warriors, his profile outlined by firelight. The path ahead has many thorns for both of you. Before Alice could ask what she meant, they were interrupted by the arrival of several women bringing food for the evening meal. The moment for confidences had passed, but White Dove's words lingered in Alice's mind. Be careful with your heart. Too late, she realized as she watched Hawkeye across the firelight, much too late. Late October, growing tensions. As autumn deepened, subtle changes came to the Apache camp. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. Warriors returned from hunting expeditions with greater frequency, building up stores for the coming winter. Women began crafting warmer clothing and repairing wickiups to withstand cold weather. Alice had integrated into the rhythm of camp life more fully than she would have thought possible. Her hands had grown calloused from work, her skin darkened from constant exposure to the sun, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to live close to the earth. She still wore her own dress, though now mended with sinew thread and supplemented with moccasins and a rabbit fur vest gifted by White Dove. Most significant was her changing relationship with the Apache themselves. While some still regarded her with suspicion, others had begun to accept her presence. Children who had once hidden from her now approached curiously, sometimes asking her to tell stories about the world beyond the mountains. A few of the women had started teaching her their language, laughing good-naturedly at her pronunciation, but praising her persistence. And then there was Hawkeye. Since the day he had given her the comb, something had shifted between them. He no longer avoided her, and they occasionally shared brief conversations when their paths crossed. Once he had even shown her how to fletch arrows, his strong hands guiding hers with unexpected gentleness. The contact had sent warmth spiraling through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Alice knew she was treading dangerous ground. These feelings that stirred within her whenever Hawkeye was near, they were impossible forbidden. He was Apache. She was the daughter of his greatest enemy. Even if her father weren't a factor, Hawkeye's heart still belonged to his dead wife. Yet knowledge did nothing to quell the quickening of her pulse when their eyes met across the camp, or the dreams that visited her in the darkness of night. White Dove, observant as always, had noticed the change. The heart chooses its own path, she had said cryptically one evening, even when the mind says the path leads nowhere. On a crisp autumn morning, Alice was grinding corn when agitated voices drew her attention. A scout had ridden into camp and was reporting to the gathered warriors, his horse lathered from hard riding. She set aside her work and moved closer, straining to understand the rapid Apache speech. She had learned enough of the language to grasp that soldiers had been spotted a large patrol moving through the territory with tracking dogs. Her father's men searching for her. The thought should have filled her with joy. Instead, she felt a complicated tangle of emotions that left her momentarily breathless. The camp erupted into activity. Warriors prepared weapons, while women began packing essential items. Children were gathered and quieted. The peaceful routine of the past months dissolved into urgent preparation. Alice stood frozen, uncertain what to do, until White Dove appeared at her side. "They come for you," the old woman said, confirming Alice's suspicion. "Your father leads them." "How far away?" 2 days' ride, perhaps less. They followed trail left by hunters returning to valley. White Dove studied her face. "You should be happy. Soon you will return to your people." "My people." The phrase struck Alice with unexpected force. Once she would have identified herself without hesitation as belonging to the world of forts and soldiers. Now she wasn't so certain. "What will happen?" she asked quietly. "Council meets now to decide." White Dove took her arm, guiding her away from the main activity. "Some say we should leave you for soldiers to find and move camp deeper into mountains. Others—" She paused. "Others want to kill me before my father arrives." Alice finished, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. White Dove didn't deny it. "There is much fear. Blue Coat is known for his tracking skills. If he finds this place, many will die." "And what does Hawkeye say?" The question slipped out before Alice could stop it. A knowing look crossed White Dove's face. "He speaks for you. Says you are under his protection." The knowledge warmed something deep inside Alice, even as fear for him tightened around her heart. "My father won't stop searching. Not until he finds me or my body. Then we must give him what he seeks," White Dove said cryptically. Before Alice could ask what she meant, the old woman led her toward her wickiup. Inside, she retrieved a small bundle wrapped in deerskin and handed it to Alice. "Open it when you are alone," she instructed. "Now I must speak with counsel." Left by herself, Alice unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside was a small leather pouch containing dried herbs that gave off a pungent aroma, a knife with a bone handle similar to the one Hawkeye carried, and most surprising, a folded paper sealed with wax. Breaking the seal, she found a roughly drawn map showing the mountains, the valley where the camp was located, and a path leading southeast toward what appeared to be a trading post. What was White Dove planning? Her contemplation was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Quickly rewrapping the bundle, she tucked it beneath her bedding just as the entrance flap was pushed aside. Hawkeye stood there, his expression grave. "Council has decided," he said without preamble. "You must leave tonight." Alice stood, her heart racing. "Leave? Where am I to go?" "Away from here before soldiers come." His voice was tense, controlled. "Black Knife and others want to leave your body for Blue Coat to find. They say it will end his hunt." A chill ran through her. "And what do you say?" Hawkeye's dark eyes held hers. "I say you have earned right to live." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond their simple truth. Alice took a step toward him, close enough to see the pulse beating in his throat. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you protect me after everything my father has done?" For a long moment, Hawkeye remained silent, the struggle evident in his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Because you are not your father. Because you work beside our women without complaint. Because you learn our ways and respect them." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Because when you look at me, you see a man, not an enemy." Alice's breath caught. "Hawkeye." He silenced her by raising his hand, touching her cheek with a gentleness that belied his warrior's strength. "White Dove has prepared for this day. She knew it would come." "The bundle," Alice murmured. "The map." He nodded. "She has seen what others cannot. There is path for you, for us, if we have courage to take it." Us hope flared within her, bright and dangerous. "I will guide you to safety," he said, his hand dropping from her face. Beyond that, he left the thought unfinished. "When do we leave?" "After nightfall. Pack only what you need." He moved toward the entrance, then paused. "Be ready when I come for you." The escape. When full darkness fell, Hawkeye appeared silently at the Wiki-Up's entrance. He wore buckskins instead of his usual breechcloth and leggings, and carried a rifle along with his knife and bow. A pack similar to Alice's was slung across his back. "It is time," he said simply. Alice followed him through the sleeping camp, keeping to the shadows. 2 horses waited at the edge of the trees, already saddled and loaded with supplies. As they mounted, she cast one last glance at the place that had been her home for these past months. "We travel by night," Hawkeye explained as they rode away. "Rest during day, less chance of being seen." They rode in silence through the darkness, Hawkeye leading with an uncanny ability to find the path, even in the dim moonlight. Alice followed closely, every sense alert for danger. They were not only fleeing from her father's soldiers, she realized, but also potentially from Hawkeye's own people, if Black Knife discovered their departure before morning. As the night wore on, the terrain grew increasingly difficult, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through narrow passes and over rocky ground. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Alice was exhausted but determined not to slow their progress. Hawkeye found a sheltered ravine where a small spring provided water. "We rest here," he said, helping her down from her horse. "Sleep while I keep watch." They ate a sparse breakfast of jerky and dried fruit. Then Hawkeye arranged a bed of blankets for Alice in the shade of an overhang. "What about you?" she asked, noticing he had made no preparations for his own rest. "I will watch," he repeated. "Sleep now." Despite her exhaustion, Alice found it difficult to relax. Every sound, the whisper of wind through juniper, the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of their horses grazing, brought her to alertness. Eventually, however, fatigue overcame vigilance, and she drifted into uneasy slumber. She woke to Hawkeye's hand on her shoulder, his voice urgent in her ear. "Riders coming. We must move." The sun was low in the western sky. She had slept through most of the day. Scrambling to her feet, she helped Hawkeye quickly pack their belongings and saddle the horses. "How many?" she whispered as they worked. 4, maybe 5, not soldiers." His expression was grim. "Black Knife leads them." Alice's blood ran cold. "How did he find us?" "I left false trail leading north. Should have held them longer." Hawkeye tightened a saddle strap with sharp efficiency. "He knows these mountains as well as I do." They mounted and rode deeper into the ravine, following it until it opened into a broader valley. As they emerged, a rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet splintering bark from a tree just ahead of them. "Ridka," Hawkeye commanded, spurring his horse forward. Alice needed no urging. They galloped across the valley floor, heading for the cover of trees on the far side. More shots followed, but the distance was too great for accuracy. They reached the tree line and plunged into the forest, weaving between trunks as bullets whined overhead. Alice ducked low over her horse's neck, heart pounding in her ears. Behind them, she could hear shouts in Apache. Their pursuers were giving chase. The forest gave way to a steep, rocky slope. Hawkeye dismounted quickly, gesturing for Alice to do the same. "Too dangerous to ride down," he explained, leading his horse forward. "Stay close." They picked their way down the treacherous incline, leading the reluctant horses. Loose stones skittered away beneath their feet, threatening to send them tumbling. Above them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Halfway down, disaster struck. Alice's foot slipped on a patch of loose shale and she fell heavily, twisting her ankle. A cry of pain escaped her before she could suppress it. Hawkeye was at her side instantly. "Can you stand?" She tried wincing as weight bore down on the injured ankle. "Yes, but I can't move quickly." He made a swift decision. "Leave horses. They will follow trail. We go another way." Abandoning the horses was a desperate measure, but Alice understood the necessity. Hawkeye helped her to more secure footing and then led her off the main path onto an even steeper track that wound between massive boulders. "Where does this lead?" she gasped, fighting through the pain with each step. "To water. Our tracks will vanish there." They descended in painful slowness, Alice leaning heavily on Hawkeye for support. Behind them, they heard their horses neighing in protest as Black Knife and his warriors captured them. "They will know we continued on foot." Alice said, despair creeping into her voice. "Yes, but not where." Hawkeye guided her around a sharp bend in the path, revealing a narrow stream that tumbled down the mountainside. "Now we walk in water." It was agonizing progress. The cold mountain stream numbed Alice's injured ankle, which was a blessing. But the slippery rocks threatened new falls with every step. Hawkeye supported her tirelessly, his arm around her waist, his strength keeping her upright when her own failed. As darkness fell again, they reached a small waterfall that cascaded into a deep pool. Hawkeye guided her behind the curtain of water where the cliff face receded to form a shallow cave. "We stay here tonight," he said, easing her down onto a relatively dry patch of stone. "Black Knife will not find this place in darkness." "And tomorrow?" Alice asked, shivering from cold and exhaustion. "Tomorrow we reach McCready's trading post." He rummaged in his pack, producing a strip of cloth which he used to bind her swollen ankle. "It is not far. If I can walk," she said grimly. Hawkeye finished bandaging her ankle, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You will walk because you must," he said simply. "You are stronger than you know, Summerhawk." She looked up at him in surprise. "That's what White Dove calls me." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She told me it suits you." He removed his buckskin shirt and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, carrying his scent, enveloped her like an embrace. "What about you?" she asked. "Won't you be cold?" "I am used to mountain nights." He settled beside her close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Rest now. I will keep watch." Alice hesitated, then leaned against him, drawn by warmth and something deeper. After a moment's tension, his arm came around her, holding her securely against his side. "Hawkeye," she said softly, "why did you really help me escape the truth?" In the dim light filtering through the waterfall, his face was all plains and shadows, revealing nothing. For so long that she thought he might not answer, he remained silent. Then, in a voice rough with emotion, he spoke. "When soldiers killed my wife and son, I vowed to hate all white people until my last breath. To kill as many as I could before joining my family in spirit world." His arm tightened around her. "Then you came, daughter of my greatest enemy. I wanted to hate you." "What changed?" she whispered. "You did." He turned to face her, their faces close in the darkness. "You showed respect for our ways, kindness to White Dove, courage, when others would have broken. His hand came up to touch her face, fingers tracing the line of her cheek. And when I looked in your eyes, I saw something I thought had died with morning star. Alice's heart thundered in her chest. What did you see? Future, he said simply. Reason to live rather than just survive. The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Then with infinite slowness, Hawkeye lowered his head until his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, when instead she leaned into him, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, it deepened into something fierce and hungry that stole her breath and ignited a fire in her blood. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Hawkeye rested his forehead against hers. This path is dangerous, he murmured. Your father will never accept it. I know, Alice replied, her decision already made. But it's my path to choose. He kissed her again, more briefly this time. Sleep now, he said, settling her against him. Tomorrow will test us both. Cradled in his arms, Alice drifted toward sleep, no longer certain which would be worse, being found by her father's soldiers or being caught by Black Knife's warriors. Both paths led to separation from the man who had become more important to her than she had ever thought possible. As consciousness faded, she made a silent vow. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would not let anyone take her from Hawkeye. Not her father, not Black Knife, not the whole United States Army. Some bonds once formed could never be broken. Dawn of reckoning. Dawn broke with tendrils of mist rising from the forest floor, shrouding the landscape in ghostly white. Alice woke to find Hawkeye already alert, his rifle across his knees as he kept watch from the cave entrance. How is your ankle? He asked when he noticed she was awake. Alice tentatively flexed her foot, wincing at the stab of pain. Swollen, but I can walk on it. Good. We leave soon. He handed her some jerky and dried fruit from his pack. Eat. You will need strength. As they shared their sparse breakfast, Hawkeye outlined their plan. McCready's trading post is half-day's journey. We follow stream until it joins river, then east to valley. Post sits where two trails meet. And once we reach it, Alice asked, what then? McCready will help us reach safe place. White Dove says he has contacts among Quakers who aid Indians wishing to live in peace. You would leave your people. The magnitude of his sacrifice struck her anew. Hawkeye's expression hardened. My path with them ended when I chose to help you escape. Black Knife will see me as traitor now. The knowledge weighed heavily on Alice. I never meant to come between you and your people. Choice was mine, he said firmly. Now we must move. They emerged from behind the waterfall into the cool morning air. Alice's ankle protested with each step, but she gritted her teeth against the pain. They couldn't afford delay, not with both soldiers and Apache warriors searching for them. They followed the stream as it wound down the mountainside, keeping to the water to hide their tracks. When the terrain allowed, Hawkeye carried Alice across his back, but much of the way was too treacherous for such an arrangement. By midday, they had reached the promised river, a broader, swifter watercourse that cut through a steep-sided valley. Here they were forced to leave the water as the current had become too dangerous to navigate. We follow riverbank, Hawkeye said, helping Alice up the slippery slope. Few hours to trading post if we move quickly. They had covered perhaps half that distance when disaster struck. Rounding a bend in the river, they came face to face with a small patrol of soldiers watering their horses. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. Then one of the soldiers shouted in recognition, "It's Miss Monroe!" Hawkeye reacted instantly, pushing Alice behind him and raising his rifle. But before he could fire, more shouts erupted from the trees behind them. Apache, take cover. The forest exploded into chaos as Black Knife and his warriors descended on the scene. Caught between the soldiers and the Apache, Hawkeye grabbed Alice's hand and pulled her toward a tumble of boulders at the river's edge. Stay down, he ordered, positioning himself to protect her as bullets and arrows flew in all directions. The soldiers, though outnumbered, had the advantage of firearms. Two of Black Knife's warriors fell in the initial exchange. The Apache responded by splitting up using the trees for cover as they picked off soldiers one by one. Alice huddled against the cold stone, heart pounding as death raged around them. Hawkeye fired his rifle with deadly accuracy whenever a target presented itself, but conserved his ammunition carefully. "We must reach other side of river," he said during a lull in the firing. "Cross downstream where rocks make path." She nodded, too terrified for words. When he gave the signal, they abandoned their shelter and scrambled along the riverbank, keeping low. They had almost reached the crossing point when a shout rang out. "There, the Apache has the colonel's daughter." A rifle cracked and stone chips exploded from the rock beside Alice's head. Hawkeye shoved her roughly to the ground, covering her body with his own, as more shots followed. "Go," he urged, rolling off her. "Cross river. I will hold them." "Not without you," she insisted, clutching his arm. His dark eyes held hers for one intense moment. "I will follow. Now go." She hesitated, then began picking her way across the river, leaping from stone to stone. Her injured ankle nearly betrayed her midway, but she caught herself before falling into the rushing water. Reaching the far bank, she turned back to see Hawkeye exchanging fire with the soldiers from behind a fallen log. Beyond him, Black Knife and 2 remaining warriors were working their way closer, using the distraction of the soldiers to approach Hawkeye from behind. "Behind you," Alice screamed in warning. Hawkeye spun just as Black Knife lunged from the underbrush, knife flashing in the sunlight. The 2 men collided in a desperate struggle, rolling across the ground as each sought advantage. Alice watched in horror, helpless across the river. Then, without conscious thought, she drew the bone-handled knife White Dove had given her and plunged back into the river, fighting the current to return to Hawkeye's side. One of the other Apache warriors spotted her and raised his bow. Before he could loose the arrow, a shot rang out, and he pitched forward into the river. Alice didn't stop to see where the shot had come from. She reached the bank just as Black Knife gained the upper hand, his knife descending toward Hawkeye's throat. Without hesitation, she launched herself at him, driving her own knife into his shoulder. Black Knife howled in pain and rounded on her, backhanding her with enough force to send her sprawling. The momentary distraction was all Hawkeye needed. He surged upward, his knife finding Black Knife's heart in one decisive thrust. As the Apache warrior collapsed, Hawkeye pulled Alice to her feet. "Why did you come back?" he demanded, his voice raw with fear and anger. "Because I love you," she answered simply. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop as they stood amid the carnage, eyes locked in a moment of perfect understanding. Then the world intruded once more. Alice Munro." The voice was deep, authoritative, and achingly familiar. Alice turned slowly to see her father emerging from the trees, flanked by a dozen soldiers. Colonel William Monroe was exactly as she remembered, tall and imposing in his blue uniform, his weathered face set in lines of iron determination. But his eyes, usually cold and distant, now held a rare emotion relief. "Father," she acknowledged, acutely aware of Hawkeye tensing beside her. Colonel Monroe took in the scene with a soldier's practiced eye, the dead Apache warriors, his daughter's changed appearance, and the tall Apache standing protectively at her side. "Step away from her, savage," he ordered, raising his pistol to point at Hawkeye's chest. "No." Alice moved between them, arms outstretched. "Father, don't shoot. He saved my life." Colonel Monroe's eyes narrowed. "Move aside, Alice. That's an order." "I will not." She stood her ground, feeling Hawkeye's solid presence behind her. "If you want to kill him, you'll have to shoot through me." Confusion and anger warred on her father's face. "Have you lost your mind, girl? This Apache butchered your escort. He took you captive, and then he protected me," Alice countered. "He risked everything to keep me safe from his own people as well as yours." Her father's gaze flicked between her and Hawkeye, reassessing the situation. "You're confused, Alice. Stockholm Syndrome, the doctors call it. Captives sometimes develop unnatural attachments to their kidnappers. It's not confusion, Father. It's clarity." She reached back, finding Hawkeye's hand and gripping it tightly. "I'm not going back with you." The colonel's face hardened. The hell you aren't. Sergeant, take that savage into custody and escort my daughter. Stop! A new voice rang out from the trees. Nobody move? All heads turned to see a bearded white man in buckskins standing at the edge of the clearing, a shotgun in his hands. Two more men flanked him, similarly armed. Jacob McCready. The newcomer introduced himself. This is my territory you're having your little war on. His shrewd eyes took in the scene. Seems to me the lady's made her choice, Colonel. Might be wise to respect it. This is a military matter, McCready, Colonel Monroe snapped. Stay out of it. Well now, that's where you're wrong. McCready stepped further into the clearing, his men spreading out behind him. See that Apache there? He has a name, by the way. It's Hawkeye. He's under my protection. Has been ever since White Dove sent word he was coming. White Dove, the colonel echoed. Wise old woman. Sees things others miss. McCready's casual tone belied the tension of the standoff. She saw that your daughter and Hawkeye here might need a fresh start. I'm inclined to help them get it. Colonel Monroe's face flushed with anger. This man is a murderer, a renegade. And you've never killed an Apache. McCready interrupted. Never burned a village or forced women and children on death marches. He shook his head. We've all got blood on our hands in this territory, Colonel. Question is whether we want to keep spilling it. A heavy silence fell over the clearing. Alice could almost see her father's mind working, calculating odds and weighing options. Alice, he said at last, his voice softer now. Captain Sterling is waiting at Fort Bowie. The wedding preparations. I'm not marrying Captain Sterling, she interrupted firmly. I never wanted to. Then come home and we'll discuss it. He pleaded, a note of desperation entering his voice. Don't throw your life away on this. Alice felt Hawkeye's hand tighten around hers. She drew strength from his silent support. My life isn't being thrown away, Father. It's just taking a different path than the one you planned. She took a deep breath. I love him, and I'm staying with him. Colonel Monroe's face went blank, as if her words had struck him physically. For a long moment, he simply stared at his daughter, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time. You would choose him over your own blood? He asked finally. I would choose love over hate, Alice replied. Something I learned from Hawkeye's people. Another silence stretched between them, weighted with years of unspoken words and missed connections. Then McCready cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, Colonel, but there's something you should know. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small worn object. White Dove asked me to give you this if we ever met. He tossed the object to Colonel Monroe, who caught it reflexively. Looking down, the colonel's face went pale. It was a small silver locket tarnished with age. Where did you get this? He whispered. From White Dove. She said you'd recognize it. McCready's voice was gentle now. Said to tell you that the young cavalry officer who saved her from renegade Comanches 15 years ago deserved to have his daughter find happiness, just as he gave her family a chance to live. Colonel Monroe opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of a young woman, Alice's mother. I lost this during the Comanche raid. He said, his voice barely audible. I thought. My White Dove found it after the battle, McCready explained. Been keeping it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment to return it. She said you were a good man who got lost in grief and duty. The colonel stared at the locket for a long moment, then looked up at his daughter with eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. Your mother would have wanted you to choose love, he said quietly. She always said I was too hard, too focused on duty. He closed the locket carefully and slipped it into his pocket. With military precision, Colonel Monroe holstered his pistol. Sergeant, he barked. Gather our dead. We're returning to the fort. Sir. The sergeant looked confused. What about Miss Monroe? The colonel's gaze lingered on his daughter one last time. Miss Monroe died in the original ambush. Is that understood? The sergeant hesitated, then saluted. Yes, sir. Without another word, Colonel Monroe turned and walked away, back straight and head held high. The soldiers followed, casting curious glances back at Alice and Hawkeye. Only when they had disappeared into the trees did Alice allow the tears to fall. Hawkeye turned her gently to face him, wiping the moisture from her cheeks with calloused thumb. You gave up everything, he said softly, wonder and guilt mingling in his voice. Alice shook her head. I gained everything that matters. Epilogue. Colorado Territory. Spring, 1877. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the small log cabin, illuminating the simple but comfortable interior. Alice stood at the kitchen window, watching Hawkeye work in their garden, preparing the soil for spring planting. In her arms, their 6-month-old son gurgled contentedly, his dark eyes, so like his father's, following the play of sunlight on the wall. It had been a year and a half since they'd arrived at the Quaker settlement in Colorado Territory, and Alice marveled at how much their lives had changed. The community had welcomed them with open arms, asking no questions about their past, offering only support for their future. Hawkeye had proven surprisingly adept at farming his hunting skills, translating well to understanding the land and its rhythms. Alice had discovered a talent for teaching, helping other members of the community learn to read and write. Together, they had built a life of quiet contentment, far from the conflicts that had once defined them. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Alice opened it to find Samuel Hartwell, the settlement's leader, holding a letter. This came for you on yesterday's stage, he said with a gentle smile. The sender paid extra to make sure it reached you. Alice took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing the flowing script on the envelope. The return address simply read, W.D. After Samuel left, Alice carefully opened the letter. Inside, written in a mixture of English and Apache, was a message from White Dove. My dear Summerhawk, the spirits whisper to me of your happiness, and my heart soars like the eagle. Your little hawk has been born safely. I know this without seeing. The path you chose was difficult, but it leads to light. The mountains grow quiet now. Many of our people have gone to the reservation, but some of us remain free in the high places. I am old, but the spirits give me strength to see this season change. Your father sends word through McCready. He does not write himself too proud still, but he asks after your health and sends his blessing for the grandson he will never see. This is progress. Love grows like the desert bloom, rare and beautiful, worth all the hardships that come before. Hold tight to what you have found. With all the love of a grandmother's heart, White Dove. P.S. The beaded blanket enclosed is for the little one. May he walk in both worlds with honor. Alice wiped away tears as she read the letter a second time. Hawkeye had come in from the garden and stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. She knows about our son. Alice marveled. White Dove sees many things, Hawkeye said softly. She always said our child would be bridge between two worlds. Alice leaned back against her husband's chest, feeling his arms encircle both her and their baby. Through the window, she could see the mountains in the distance, purple and majestic against the morning sky. Somewhere in those heights, White Dove continued her vigil, keeping alive the old ways while blessing the new. The baby cooed and reached for his father's finger with tiny, perfect hands. Hawkeye smiled, an expression that came so easily to him now, and spoke softly in Apache, then translated for Alice. I told him he is loved by 3 worlds, he explained. Apache, White, and the new world we make together. Alice turned in his arms to face him. No regrets, only that it took so long to find you, he replied, kissing her forehead. And you? She looked around their simple home, filled with love and laughter, then at the man who had taught her that courage and forgiveness could triumph over hatred and fear. No regrets, she said firmly, only gratitude. Outside, a hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the valley, wild and free, like the love that had brought them to this moment. Alice Monroe had chosen her path, and it had led her home at last. As she had told her father that day by the river, she had not thrown her life away. She had found it at last in the arms of a warrior who had learned to love again, and in doing so had taught her to truly live. Some bonds once formed could never be broken. Some choices once made echoed through generations. And some love stories born in the shadow of hatred burned bright enough to light the way for all who came after.